Hi, welcome to another installment of Opening the Writer's Desk, where we take a deep dive into writing tips from today's most widely read authors. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at author George R.R. Martin and the techniques he used in his writing. If you don't know George R.R. Martin, you have probably heard of or seen the TV series Game of Thrones. And if you haven't, you need to get out more. I'm just kidding. I actually haven't watched it myself, but I do know about it. The show, Game of Thrones, was an adaptation of Martin's fantasy series called A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, whether you're a hardcore fantasy fan or you'd prefer, a romance or cozy mystery, Martin is no doubt one of the biggest novelists of all time. So let's check out a few tips straight from the man himself. Let's go. Tip number one from George R.R. Martin is to, quote, read and read everything. Martin says, again, quote, the most important thing for any aspiring writer, I think, is to read. And not just the sort of thing you're trying to write, be that fantasy, science fiction, comic books, whatever. You need to read everything. Every writer has something to teach you, for good or ill, end quote. I think this is pretty much the best advice there is for a writer, to read. There are some authors who will say that their only writing advice for writers is in fact to read, which makes sense. The more you read, the more you open yourself up to new possibilities of how to tell a story. You see what other writers are doing that you want to emulate or that you don't want to emulate. You can learn how you don't want to tell a story. For years, I thought I was supposed to be writing literary fiction if I was going to write fiction at all. And I believe this because that was the kind of fiction that I knew won awards, that got reviewed in the New York Times. It was the kind of fiction that seemed to make people, think you as the writer are really, really smart. So of course, that's what I was supposed to be writing, right? The problem was that I would often read books categorized as literary fiction, and they wouldn't be my favorite. I didn't really love a lot of them. What I loved reading were more commercial fiction novels that were nonetheless still smart and complex. I loved the writing, but I loved books with plot and character development. And it was reading some of these books that made me think, this is what I want to do. I want to write like these people. So when George R.R. Martin and I tell you to read, I hope you know we're not giving you homework that's supposed to be a slog. I want you to read what you enjoy, because that's what you're going to be best at writing too. All right, tip number two from George is to make a habit of writing. The more you write, he says, the better you'll get. Every writer needs to learn to create his own characters, worlds, and settings. If you don't exercise those literary muscles, you'll never develop them, end quote. So even if you haven't written a creative word since 7th grade, you can get back into the practice of writing, but you gotta do it. And look, you don't have to write every day. I used to hate that adage that a writer writes every day. I still do. I don't write every day. Not even close. I do when I'm actively working on a project, but months go by when I'm not working on projects. I'm like Cheryl Strayed, who calls herself a binge writer in this way. Still, I agree with Martin that the more you write, the better you'll get. Your first book is probably not going to be your best book. And hopefully, right? Because if it were, that would mean you weren't improving. It's so important to write before you're ready, to write when the writing feels bad, to write even when you don't know what you're doing, because it's the only way we learn and the only way we get better. If you can give yourself permission to not be perfect, and not only not be perfect, but not even to be very good, you might find it easier to find the words you want because you're not preoccupied with getting everything, quote unquote, right. So here's a suggestion. Set aside some time regularly to write, even if it's not every day. That project that you have in mind that you want to start, just start it. Even if you're not ready, just go. You'll improve by just doing it. You'll find things you don't like, but you're going to learn that way. And it's the only way you're going to learn. Tip number 3 from Martin is that action should have consequences. How do you make a story compelling? Well, one of the most important skills, I think, also one of the hardest to get used to if you're not familiar with it, is causality. Okay, what do I mean by causality? Well, in real life, there's cause and effect. Someone does something and there's a reaction. If I put a car key in the ignition of my car and I turn it, I start the engine. Cause is me turning the key, effect is my car start. The effect, the car starting, doesn't happen on its own, and it doesn't happen before I turn my key in the ignition. This is causality. The events in your story, you want to be linked in this way. One thing leads to another. Now, things don't always have to be this literal or linear. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. We don't need every single event to be connected to the previous in this way. But just more generally speaking, we do want your character's actions to have effects. What they do has a consequence, for better or worse. And that consequence will play into future events in the story. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, that became Game of Thrones, is known for characters facing unforeseen consequences of their actions. And the characters who hold political power often do things that have sweeping effects on the world they live in. This is something your audience will want to see to keep them engaged and invested in your story's outcome, that your characters' actions have consequences. Okay, before I share 2 more tips with you, I just want to invite you to apply to my program, the Book Incubator. The link is down below this video. It's only 2 questions, takes less than 5 minutes. And if you're writing a book, you'll definitely want to check it out. Now back to the video. Tip number 4 from George R.R. Martin is to outline only if you think it's helpful. I talk a lot about outlining in my writing program, but not for the reason you might think. In general, outlining doesn't work for me. This doesn't mean it doesn't work for everyone, but in my experience, I've found that writing toward answering a big thematic question is actually more helpful because it gives me the freedom to discover what is going to happen in my story instead of forcing me to stick with a kind of preconceived set of events. I learned that George R.R. Martin actually leans away from outlining as well. And he describes these 2 camps of writing style as architects and gardeners. Here's his quote. He says, "I think there are 2 types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed, and water it. As the plant comes up and they water it, they don't know how many branches it's going to have. They just find out as it grows. And I'm much more of a gardener than an architect." End quote. Again, if you like outlining, that's fine. But I think there are a lot of writers out there, myself included, that have sometimes forced themselves to map out their first draft because they thought they were supposed to, when what they'd prefer is to explore the world that they're creating as they go. So I don't think you should feel obligated to outline unless you just want to. Tip number 5 is to show up inconsistently and badly, but to show up anyway. Now, this is obviously, maybe not obviously, but this is my own paraphrase based on another great quote from George R.R. Martin, which is, "Sometimes you eat the bear and sometimes the bear eats you." Imagery is a little morbid, but I really dig the sentiment here. The truth is that resistance, which is the inevitable pushback from inside our own psyches whenever we're in arm's reach of our goals, is very good at convincing us to put things off, including making us think that if we're going to show up badly, we're going to fail, so we just shouldn't try at all. And that could not be farther from the truth. When you set a goal to write a book, you are setting yourself up to constantly disappoint yourself. This is inevitable. It's just how it works. You're not going to show up every day as you plan. You won't write for your goal time every day or even most days. You may not hit your goal word count on more days than you do hit it. And somehow, miraculously, you will still finish your book. And when you do, no one will be more stunned than you. Because writing a book is not about showing up consistently. It's about showing up inconsistently and showing up anyway. Showing up badly with other stuff to do, with far from a perfect idea of what you're going to write that day, with a mess of a plan in your head, if you have a plan at all, with lessons from the writing course that you haven't even watched yet, with the wrong pen, almost out of ink, your notebook your kid did his math homework in, you have 20 minutes to write instead of 90 like you planned. But despite all of this, you do it anyway, and you do it over and over, and eventually it still gets done. You can only finish the books that you choose not to give up on, in spite of life happening as you write. So those are some writing tips from George R.R. Martin. If you made it this far in the video, I'm guessing that you're writing a book or you want to write a book. And if so, I would love to hear from you. Because when I'm not writing, my mission in life is to help writers write their dream books. I love it. I live for it. If you're curious to know more, I have a free video walking you through my exact process for writing a book. You can get it by clicking below and answering 2 questions to apply to my program, the Book Incubator. You can get the video whether you join or not. There's not pressure to enroll. So just click below to tell me a little bit about you and your book or your book idea. I'm so excited to hear from you.